Okay, so I wanted to do a video comparing an old Spartan and a new Spartan. And at the top there is my old Spartan from 1946 to 1950, thereabouts, we've seen before, the one I refurbished. And the one in the bottom there is a new Spartan. That one's actually from 2012. It's a 115-year anniversary limited edition, but it's pretty much just a plain Jane Spartan. And for what I'm going to do in this video is just compare the scale tools and the scales. If you want to see a good comparison on tools between an old Victorinox and a newer one, take a look at my vintage climber versus a new climber video where I kind of go through each and every tool. Before I get started talking about the scales, I just want to say one thing. You know, I originally bought one of these that was pretty nice, and it really didn't even need to be refurbished. I just cleaned it up and then I sold it for a profit, which was great. But I immediately regretted it and went about finding another one. So I was able to buy this one, which needed help, and so I refurbished it. But I don't know how to describe it, but when you have one of these in your hands, compared to one of the new ones, it just kind of feels like holding a fine watch compared to a less expensive watch. And, you know, this knife just is a little heavier and feels more solid, and it's got a little better look to it. I know it's heavier because it's got nickel silver liners instead of aluminum. It's got a little thicker blade and tools, but it also just feels more solid. You know, this one has the pinned-on scales, and this one has the snap-on scales. And you know, there's voids under there to take the scale tools like the toothpick, the tweezers, a pin perhaps. But this knife just, I don't know how to describe it, it just has a quality feel to it that as again, it's like having a fine watch compared to an ordinary, less expensive watch. So these are great, I really love them. Just to talk about the scales then, I guess the first thing we'll talk about are the composition of the scales. In 1897 they came out with the Spartan, and they originally had wood fiber scales. I don't have one that old, but I do have an old Soldier, and that's what wood fiber scales look like, of course. They're actually wood fiber with resin, and they're pretty durable, but I think they had a problem with them in hot, humid climates. I remember seeing a Wanger advertisement from back in the day when they were just coming out with their version of the Selador scales, the plastic scales, and they made a big deal out of how they held up really well in tropical climates. These old wood fiber scales tended to crack and warp pretty easily, particularly around the rivets. And so then in 1937, Victorinox came out with what they call Selador scales. And they still use Selador today. Now, they use a lot of different materials. You know, they use, of course, ALOX or aluminum on some of their knives. They started that in 1957 with the original Pioneer, and I'm really not talking about that. Let's just talk about the officers and sports model, this kind of the Spartans and the standards. But they've had lots of different special scales like horn and wood and stag and stainless steel and silver and things like that. But on their basic production runs, basically they had fiber scales from 1897 up to 1936. They had Selador from 1937 to present. And I'll talk about what Selador is in a minute. In 1994, according to Victorinox, they came out with nylon handles. Nylon handles were introduced, and I have to think they mean just for the Spartan or the 91mm knives and maybe the 84mm knives, because they had nylon when they came out with the German Army knife. They made German Army knives from 1976 to 1986, and they all had nylon scales. And they also used those in the Safari Trooper line, which ran up until 2003. But just kind of going through some of the development of the scales, then in 1999 they had translucent scales, introduced your translucent scales. They're Selador, by the way. I'm almost positive of that. In 2003 they came out with Stay Glow scales, you know, the glow-in-the-dark ones. You can still find those on the Rescue tool. It uses nylon or a how do they call it? Polyamide. That's just nylon. And it's also used on the Boy Scout edition of the Climber. So you can still get some stay-glow scales there. 2003, no, I'm sorry, like in 2009 or 10, they came out with soft touch scales. And I think they introduced those with that Climber Road Tour series. And from all I can gather, the soft touch is just Selador with a rubber coating on it. Okay, so what is Selador? Well, according to the Science Dictionary, it is the trade name for acetate butyrate cellulose in European countries. But that doesn't tell me a whole lot. So currently the name Selador is registered to Albus Plastic, which is a global company, and it's headquartered in Hamburg, Germany. And according to their website, Selador is an organic thermoplastic cellulose ester, which consists of approximately 45% cellulose, a renewable natural material. So that's from their website, Albus's website. And you know, cellulose is plant wood fiber, cotton, and used primarily to make paper products. So, you know, there's a lot of organic material in cellulose, and therefore it's good for the environment and recyclable. Now, Victorinox's website, when you go to look at these type of knives, they'll list the scale composition as ABS/Selador. Well, I think we all know what ABS is. It's a different kind of plastic. It's a thermoplastic. And by the way, thermoplastic means you can remelt it. I didn't know this, but thermoset plastic, it can only be melted one time. There's a chemical composition change, and you can only form it one time. Thermoplastic can be melted, brought to its melting point, and reformed several times. But you know, ABS is an opaque plastic that you see a lot, high impact kind of plastic. They make Legos out of it. The keys on your computer keyboard are made out of it. And so I just have to think that maybe on the website, when they list ABS/Selador, that the ABS part may be talking about maybe some knives they inherited from Wenger, maybe some of that Delamont series, like the Evolution scales that have that formed ergonomic handle, or maybe the Ranger Grip series. I don't know. I'm just guessing about that. And then again, I want to talk a little more about polyamide. When you go on the website and you look at, let's say, the 111 millimeter knives, like a Soldier, they'll say that this is a 2 composite scale. Well, they're talking about the nylon and this silicone or siliconized rubber. And so all the rest of them that, you know, like a Trekker or something that's solid, doesn't have that dual composite, they just call it polyamide. And polyamide is basically nylon. Nylon is was kind of DuPont's trade name. So that's just kind of a rundown on the different scales and the scale material. It's kind of interesting that Albus Plastic, which owns the trademark to Selador, they spell it with 2 L's. And you go on to the Victorinox website, it's spelled with 1 L. And I don't know, maybe that's a language thing or maybe that's a legal thing, I don't really know. Okay, so that's just kind of run down on the composition, and then just quickly to talk about some of the tools. You know, the new ones have toothpicks and tweezers. Actually, the old ones did too, some of them. They actually brought out the toothpicks and tweezers in 1902. And originally the toothpicks were ivory. And now they're plastic, of course, and I don't know when they made that change, but it must have been, you know, a long time ago. Now the the tweezers can be used to date your knife. The tweezer tips here, the handle basically, if you will, was nickel silver when it originally came out in 1902. And it was nickel silver all the way up until 1957 when they made this aluminum. And then from 1957 and 1978 it was aluminum, and then it went to plastic like you have today. Although they did continue the aluminum tip tweezers after 1978 for some special knives, limited edition knives, horn scales and things like that. And then the other thing I want to point out is the emblem. You know, originally with the fiber knives there was no emblem. And the emblem was introduced in 1909, the Victorinox Cross and Shield. It was originally nickel silver like this. and stayed nickel silver like this until 1980, when they switched to stainless steel. And you'll notice that I think the nickel silver has a little better sheen to it. Now I have a lot of people, I see a lot of people referring to that as kind of a gold shield. It's only gold if it tarnishes. I had one, I was selling one, and a guy kept asking me, does it have the gold shield? And I kept going back to him and saying, well, it's got a nickel silver shield and it's silver in color. Yeah, but is it gold? And no, that one wasn't tarnished. I did have one where it was just perfectly half tarnished. The top was gold and the bottom part was silver. There's a difference in the design. It's very slight, but if you'll notice that the outline around the cross is thicker in the old nickel silver ones up till 1980, and then it's a little thinner from there on out. Just a couple other things, exposed rivets up until 1961. So if you've got a knife with exposed rivets, it's probably 1961 or before. A bail as opposed to a key ring, I've talked about that, but that carried that up until 1968 if your knife had a bail, and then it transitioned over to the key ring over a period of years into the 70s. So anyway, that's just a kind of a rundown on differences between a old Spartan and a new Spartan. These are probably about 60-something years apart. And again, if you want to see the differences in the tools, go take a look at my climber comparison video. Thanks for watching, and have fun collecting.